Okay, hello, buddies. Let's jump into the second part of 4.5. And here we're going to go into um, all the things that affect society. And a big thing we're going to talk about here is African slavery. Um, the first thing to know is the population of Africa is very much um, devastated by the Atlantic slave trade. Um, but it starts with the Mediterranean countries pulling African slaves up from the northern part of Africa, and then also on the east coast of Africa in the Indian Ocean. Now, Mediterranean sea trade and then Indian Ocean trade should be uh, should make you think of um, economics and the way that a lot of this uh, trade is happening. That it's a lot of powerful people making a lot of money, and that falls on uh, people who are subjugated. As far as we move over to the Caribbean and Brazil, we see a very harsh version of slavery, um, to where in those areas, life expectancy once the people arrive is only 3 years. The And then, like I was saying earlier, the devastation to the population. And this is not me being like anti-feminist or anything like that, but where to propagate a population, um, definitely you need to have uh, people who can procreate, and also kind of the traditional family structure that isn't so traditional today, um, was, and that ends up being a thing that is going to change African society. It's going to move them away from a patriarchal society, which means dominated by the male, and to a matriarchal society for a lot of places, not all of Africa, but a lot. And then, like I was talking about earlier, procreation, less men are is going to lead to lower population in general. Um, so they say uh, uh, around 11 million people. So that's two and a half Kentuckians or two and a half Kentuckies worth of people are going to be moved from Africa to the Americas. And we'll talk about how 1 in 5 of them died in the Middle Passage between Africa and the Americas. And it's going to have an impact on both groups involved. Um, so, this word diaspora, we've talked about before, but just to remind you, diaspora means a mass movement of people, and it's usually, or a mass migration of people, and it's usually forced or at least coerced. And in the Americas, we're going to see new communities formed of these African slaves and these descendants of African slaves. A really good example of that would be Jamaica. So when you think of Jamaica, you think of a person with like really dark skin and dreadlocks, you like Bob Marley, right? But the truth is, they are Jamaicans because they were born in Jamaica, but their lineage goes back to their descendants uh, for uh, for a majority of African slaves. And so when we think about an an ethnic Jamaican, this person is going to have much lighter skin and straight hair, and they're going to look more like a Native American than an African. But one of the main reasons you don't think about that person when you think about a Jamaican is because of the great dyeing that we've talked about before. Um, and once most of the natives are dead, then we come up to a point where um, that's a major push to bring in um, more Africans there. Um, the impact it's going to have on Europeans is they're going to get super rich. They're going to get really powerful, and they're going to take that wealth and that power and exert it over the world um, up until really the mid 1900s. And then another thing to think about the African slave trade is um, it becomes a metaphor for people being stepped on. Um, and um, yeah, so it it doesn't downplay the transatlantic slave trade to say that most societies throughout history have had slaves. And it doesn't downplay the Atlantic slave trade to say that many Africans captured and sold slaves. Um, and a thing that I've said before, I don't know if I've said it in this unit or not, is the letters POW, which stand for prisoners of war. So pretty much once a society starts to war, then they start to accrue slaves. And that happens because they take prisoners, and then, a lot of those prisoners are killed. A lot of those prisoners get returned in like negotiations, but a lot of those prisoners become slaves. And the first really widespread major use of slave labor was the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had a huge military, and as they spread, they took on more and more slaves, and then they employed those slaves out to the world um, to uh, to really build the Colosseum and the watered aqueducts and all those things. That's not to say that in early Mesopotamia they didn't have slaves; they did. You may know about in the Bible the Jews were enslaved by ancient Egypt. And it's just something that takes place because of war, because of war. So, um, but we're going to talk about how this is different. Okay. A lot of times slavery ends up being a thing where they become a sort of like a house servant. And sometimes we have manumission. And remember that manumission is allowing for slaves to go free. So a lot of times, well, not a lot of times, but especially in Latin America, we're going to see instances um, of uh, of slave owners allowing the children of their slaves to go free. We're going to see a lot less of that in the southern U.S. So, what's distinctive about the Atlantic slave trade as far as comparing it to just slavery from other times in history? Um, so, there's um, so the two biggest things are one, the numbers. Okay, the numbers are gigantic. Um, More slaves were taken during this time period than any other time in history up until this point. Now, you may have heard people say that today there are more slaves than ever in history, and that's true. But it's not the traditional kind of slavery that we think about. It's human trafficking, and it takes place a lot here in the Americas because people are brought in illegally, and they're forced to work and forced to be submissive to slave owners. The second biggest thing about this that is very different from before is in the Americas, slavery is lined up with blackness, race. And now we can see it lined up with ethnicity in warring um, groups across history, right? One group conquers another. And so the people that they conquer become their slaves. But here it is a racial dimension. It is a situation where if you have African lineage, you are, for the most part, assumed to be a slave. And it is because you are black, therefore you are a slave. And other things are not taken into account. Some other things that are really major is that it was plantation agriculture, which was really, really harsh, and that the people were dehumanized. There are people who, I mean, there are laws in the books um, in the United States that referred to African slaves as property, not as human beings. And in other instances, we see that in world history, but the severity of it is something that's unique to this time period. And then slavery, because slavery is attached to race, um, slavery is inherited. Your slave status is inherited, and so your offspring are going to be slaves simply because they're your offspring, um, and so that's something that's pretty unique here. Hey, looks like I have a double slide. Um, so, what caused the slave labor during this time period to grow? The first thing is sugar. That's why I always drink Diet Mountain Dew and use Splenda in my coffee because I don't want to contribute to historical slavery. Okay, so sugar in the new world is going to really, like I say it quite often, that sugar is the slave crop. It's not cotton. It's not tobacco. Now, slaves were employed to grow cotton and grow tobacco, but it is nowhere near as there's not as many slaves doing this. Um, and um, and we've seen sugar before in India, and it's not like sugar is only a new world thing, but the way they start to manufacture the sugar and crystallize the sugar is a big part of this. Um, the markets that open up, um, we have the Indian Ocean is open to Europeans. We have New World and Europe open, and even African markets to sell not just sugar but stuff. Um, is is a really big thing that's going to lead to African slavery to grow. And also this really warped idea of Jesus would be cool with me owning slaves as long as I don't enslave other Christians. And so that's a major thing that drives this, and people, how religious people were in this time period is up for debate, but we're at a point here where um, uh, there's some kind of moral high ground going on. So as we look at some of the kind of hypocritical versions or ideas about slavery, we will move on to some of the effects. Like I said earlier, it's going to slow population growth. It's going to stagnate the economy. And one thing that I think we talked about during the Triangle Trade was a major thing that got traded from Europeans to Africans was guns. And I'm not saying there wasn't a gun on the continent of Africa, because there were. Um, but if you think about someone who has taken a slave in war, um, and they decide to sell that slave for weaponry, then now we have armed a group of slave owners and warmongers. And we can kind of take a good guess at where they go next. And they're going to go and they're going to take more slaves. And as the demand rises for slaves from the Europeans, the supply is going to rise. And the Europeans really helped the supply rise by arming slave owners. Okay. Um, we're going to see um, we're going to see uh, empires and communities and civilizations um, go to war simply to get more slaves to sell on the coast. Okay. And make sure that you understand this. The fact that people from Africa sold African slaves to Europeans, and somehow that can make a white guy feel better about slavery, is really kind of flawed thinking. Because as Americans, we think of, well, an African's an African, right? They're all black, so therefore they're all connected. And it's really kind of messed up that one of those African guys will kidnap another African guy and then sell him to a European guy. But the thing that people don't take into account is that they're warring factions. They're different people. Think about it like this: you see yourself as an American citizen, right? But you don't really see yourself as a member of North America, right? You're not on the same team, right, as Canada and Mexico. However, you do share a continent, right? And so, if we went to war with Mexico, it wouldn't be the same as the American Civil War. Because they're two different groups. So there's the end of first period. I'll be back soon. Hey, buddies, I'm back. Now I don't have a mask on because it's my planning period. So to get back into it, um, we see here Benin. Benin is a kingdom in Africa, and we see the rulers in that kingdom as those people that I talked about who would invade um, a town and take um, take hostage um, the people there, to take to the western coast of Africa to sell to the Europeans. And so the point I want to make is that yes, there was slavery in Africa, and it was on a much smaller scale, and it was a product of war. As demand for slaves goes up, and we arm the slavers in Africa, um, we'll see this huge boom in in slave capturing coming across and to the Europeans on the west coast. And Benin is one of those kingdoms that did that. Okay, so they call sugar the first modern industry, and the reason that is because sugar cane spoils just a few days after it's cut. So there's this huge rush to crystallize it, to turn it into crystals, so it will keep. In that situation, you're gonna have a very sophisticated setup to get it crystallized fast. But on top of that, we're going to see that there's lots of capital. The capital is money that you use to invest. Um, we're going to see new technology. We're going to see both skilled workers and a whole lot of slave labor. Um, and we're going to see sugar be sold all around the world. And a lot of that has to do with all of the colonies and outposts around the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans that the Europeans have. The work is super dangerous. I got some quotes for you I'm going to share here in a second of just people dying left and right from exhaustion because of the rush to get the sugar crystallized before it spoils. And so, in like I said before, sugar was not a thing. It's not a thing that was invented in the Caribbean, in Brazil. The first people to crystallize sugar are actually Indians in India, um, and um, and we see on the Mediterranean they start crystallizing it and selling it as well. Um, and the process is still really dangerous, um, really tough, and so in the Mediterranean, they would bring people from the Black Sea region. You may have heard of Yugoslavia before. Yugoslavia was a really big country, or a really big satellite country of the USSR. And the people in that area around the Black Sea were called Slavs. And those Slavs that were brought to the Mediterranean to produce sugar and other things, that's where we get the word in English slave from. So that's something to think about. And as time goes on, a lot of Africans from the western part of Africa are sold up into the Mediterranean. And I want to point this out too, because if you just read that, it sounds like I'm saying um, the dangerous work was good for slaves. And that's not what I mean. What I mean is um, if you're a slave owner and you have this expendable property, then a dangerous place is where you would want to put slaves, as opposed because you don't view slaves as human. Whereas maybe if you had hired people from your own culture, you would feel bad about them dying. And I'm not saying that there weren't Europeans who felt bad about the way the slaves were treated, but we can paint with a broad brush here and say that they kind of rationalized it away when they look at Africans as not being human, and they dehumanize them so much. Okay, so this is a lot of common sense stuff about Europeans and the role that they played. Um, they're going to be the people who are going to move African slaves to the Americas um, for sugar mainly, um, and um, and so when I say they tried to capture their own slaves, it was really natives that they tried to capture. Um, but they end up giving up on that. The biggest reason is disease and how 90% of the natives are going to die just from coming into contact with the Europeans. Another thing is that the natives knew the lay of the land, they could escape. And they could live off the land. Whereas when we get Africans brought in, the diseases are not as much of a problem because Africans do interact with a lot of the same animals that Europeans do, and so they've built up that immunity. And then also, they don't know the lay of the land. I mean, they're in a completely different world now, and so. The Europeans, when they find that out, they use that to subjugate them. Um, we talked about trading guns to get POWs and how that leads to more slaves being captured. And um, when when we talk about what the Europeans do as far as slavery goes, Portugal along that western coast of Africa is going to, start moving African slaves to the Americas. But we'll see Spain, we'll see the Dutch, and we'll see England. And Spain, the Dutch, England, and really France should be here too because of Haiti and a couple of colonies that they're going to hold in South America. So we see this boom come from Europeans. So this is a pretty telling pie chart I have here. Um, and pie charts, of course, are my favorite because they remind me of pie, not the number, the dessert. Um, and so here we see roughly between 1500 and 1850 the destinations of slaves. And so we're going to have the biggest part of them going to Brazil and the Caribbean, with just a um, a much smaller part going to mainland North America. Those are slaves in the American South for the most part, cotton plantations and tobacco plantations that we think about. But it only makes up about 3.6% of the overall African slaves, and a similar number to mainland Spanish America. That's talking about South America, Central America, and Mexico. When you think of a Mexican person, you don't think of someone with Spanish heritage. But like I said, when you think of I'm sorry, you don't think of someone with African heritage, but when you think of a person from Jamaica, you do, and you can see that clearly in this pie chart. I have another. Um, so what this does is show you kind of a timeline of the African slave trade. I'm just zooming in on this puppy so you can see it better. So the 1492 is Columbus, and we see it start to ramp up in the early 1600s, and just exponential growth up until the 1750s. Um, the peak is going to be up until around 1800. We'll see it drop a little bit up to 1850, and we all know that um, uh, the 1860s is the American Civil War, but we also start to see European countries start to ban slavery and not ban slavery, but ban import the importing of new slaves. And so these are this is not the number of slaves in the world. This is the number of slaves that are arriving in the New World. One thing I want to point out is only about 20% of the slaves that leave Africa are going to make it to the Americas. Okay. And that's an important thing to know because when we see that 2 million slaves arrived in the Americas in between 1776 and 1800, what that means is 10 million were captured and sold, and 8 million of them died in the Middle Passage. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind. As part of what role did the Africans play? We talked about this before. We're going to see Africans capture mostly prisoners of war, and we're going to see them transport them to the coast. Um, another group of people who are enslaved are debtors. So you owe a lot of debt. You're in trouble. A lot of that is going on in Africa. And again, I want to reiterate, it's buying and selling slaves um, and capturing slaves. Um, it's easy for some groups and kingdoms and tribes to do for the same reason that it's easy for a lot of the Europeans to do. And it's that they don't see the slaves as human beings. Okay. And just because Africans sold Africans does not mean slavery is a lie or a joke. Um, because, you know, Africans don't see people on, we live on this continent, we're the same person. Now, as we get into the 1800s and the 1900s, we see Pan African movements where it's kind of this idea of let's come together to try to help our continent. Um, but even today, um, Africa is broken up into many countries, and those countries have civil wars, and it's way more complicated than some black people sold some black people to some white people, um, and we really should consider that. Um, so here is um, here is a quote that was written down by a European um, who saw the slave trade firsthand. And I'm not going to say that word just because I don't want to say that word. But he says the people are so willful and I think I should say loathing to leave their own country, that they often leaped out of the canoes, boats, ship into the sea and kept underwater until they drowned to avoid being taken up and saved by our boats. And I think that is pretty telling of, them, the fear of what comes next, and the way they have likely been treated before being taken off on those boats. Um, why Africa? Why is Africa the place that slaves are coming from? Um, the Slavs, the original slaves, are now controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And remember, the Ottoman Empire is basically an enemy to Christianity at this time, because they're Muslims, and they at times encroached on European kingdoms. We talked about how the natives died from disease. We can't enslave other Christians. Um, Africans know how to farm, and they're easy to buy. There's a market. They are they are um, they are sold at very low prices when you consider the amount of work that these people will do. Um, and then, because slavery is set up the way it is, you will see a lot of slave owners encourage slaves to get married and have children, because then that is a slave that they don't have to pay for at all. That new baby, and you'll see children working on these plantations and in these mines, and it's just a really gruesome thing to think about. Um, a lot of the African slaves are from West Africa, um, Mauritania, Angola, the Gold Coast. That's kind of where that was. Um, it starts on the West Coast, but as demand picks up, the slavers move inland, and like I said, criminals, debtors, prisoners of war, and we don't see a lot of people selling their own people. Okay, and that's something we've mentioned a few times. Here's another map, and the reason I brought this map up is it kind of shows what the pie chart showed, but it shows exactly where these places are coming, or where these people are coming from. And you can see again the numbers are really similar: 5% to the U.S., 60 to the West Indies, and to the Caribbean, 35 and more to Brazil, and mostly from the west coast of Africa. But you can see some east coast too, Mozambique and Madagascar. Um, and One thing I failed to mention earlier is this idea that because only 5% of the total amount of African slaves end up in the United States, that means that slavery in the United States is not that big of a deal. Okay, that's just something I completely disagree with. The the slaves that came to the United States, especially in the American South, were tortured and maimed and killed and worked to death and treated horribly. And you know, 13% of the Americans today are African Americans, and a vast majority of them are descendants of slaves. Okay, we had a civil war over slavery, and I know someone's going to say it was about states' rights, and that is true. and it was about states' rights to let people own slaves. Okay, we have there's still so much tension and so much um, grief and sadness in the African American community today because of slavery. And a lot of guilt and a lot of issues in the white community because of slavery. And, a lot of times for people who don't interact with African Americans often, and the only time they see a black person is on TV, they don't really get the gravity of, of what slavery has done to American citizens, as well as African citizens, and it's something to think about. And then at the end of the day, we are only who we are, and so I don't know what it's like to be a slave. I don't know what it's like to be a black person in the United States. And so, um, the way I look at it is, I'm going to give people the benefit of the doubt, and for me, that's something that works. And I'm going to listen to people, and I'm going to try to understand them, but I'm also going to bear in mind that I can't perfectly understand someone because I'm not them. But so don't think that just because 5% of African slaves went to the United States, that means slavery is not a big deal in the United States. Okay. And think about Brazil and how multicultural they are today. And again, this is the third time I mentioned Jamaica, right? And how African cultures um, and African people permeate the population. Um, another really big one is Haiti, the Haitians, and we're going to see a very rad revolution that's going to take place in the 1800s um, in the in Haiti, um, rising up against their French oppressors. And so, and Haiti is a very um, interesting. They have a very interesting history, and it's very tied back to slavery. There's lots of other important things in Haitian history, but we can trace a lot of the issues back to slavery. Here's a few quotes that I wanted to share with you guys. I have this really bad habit of not writing where these quotes come from. Um, it looks like these are just from Strayer, our author. Nowhere else, with the possible exception of ancient Greece, was widespread slavery associated with societies affirming values of human freedom and dignity. All right. So what that's saying is, ancient Greece is like, we're the birthplace of democracy. We believe in the humanity of every citizen. Oh, wait, get out of my face, slave. Get over there. You're not a person. Um, and another question that I took from the text was, um, so the black slave system, is that something that started by Muslims or Europeans? And we can make the argument that the Muslims, the North Africans, uh, capturing black slaves and bringing them up and selling them into the Mediterranean, is part of the history of the African slave system, and so but then we also need to consider the sheer numbers of slaves that were sold on the Atlantic, started by the Europeans. Um, so we have a historian here that says Europeans were better able to tolerate their brutal exploitation of Africans by imagining that these Africans were an inferior race, or better still, not even human. And that's something I've mentioned a few times, and it's really something to consider. Um, let's see here. Um, ah, So we're going to move to what was going on in Latin America. And the first is the encomienda system. The encomienda system is the king of Spain said, um, "We, the conquistadors, the Spanish, own this land, and anyone who's on this land is property of the Spanish crown." And I put here remaining natives because remember, 90% of them are dead. Um, they work the land. They have these huge plantations, sugar, of course. And we talked about Potosi at least once, and I think twice. That huge silver mine in Peru and Bolivia. So that's where the Aztecs and the Mayans were for the encomienda system. As far as the Inca go, it's the Mata system, and this is like a particularly insidious plan because the Europeans were able to take something that was good and that was logical and turn it into something that's really evil. And so the way things went were the Incans were, or the Inca were, they had a system where uh, uh, on 5 days a year, you would have to go work for the government, building dams or bridges or working the fields. And so everybody does a certain number of days a year. We all pitch in, and then we all reap the rewards. It sounds kind of communist, right? And so we're at a situation where my phone is ringing. Hang on. Oh, who could it be? Ooh, I don't know this number. Hang on, friends. So we're at a place where um, there's a lot of migrants that are coming to the Americas, but a lot of this is in British North America. And so, but in the Caribbean and Brazil, it's mostly African slaves. Um, so a colony, you definitely should know that a colony is when a group of people moves somewhere. So they send their people to live there permanently. And as far as Spain and Portugal go, they are going to really move into a place where they're very hands on in the whole setup. Whereas in they're going to use viceroys, and viceroys are, I call them assistant kings. A lot of times um, they're going to need the approval of the king, but because it's really hard to send a tweet in 1600, they're not going to be able to get in touch with the king so much. So they are going to have some autonomy. Whereas the Dutch, the French, and England, they're not going to use a lot of direct rule. And especially England, up where we have the 13 colonies, because England has its hands off, and also because England is dealing with their own drama. They're going to grow to be self-sufficient. Each of the colonies are going to have their own government, um, and um, and so a lot of people say this is why England so easily broke away, or sorry, the colonies so easily broke away from England, and how they also kind of saw themselves as separate from England. And so, of course, you have some people that were loyalists and swore fealty their fealty to the king. There's going to be a lot of people who see themselves as different, as not British citizens. Okay, and now in the home stretch, we're going to talk about belief systems, and belief systems are religions, right? Okay, so we're going to see a lot of spread of Christianity, and we're going to see the three main branches of Christianity go to different places. Okay, the first, well, the newest branch, right, Protestants, because that was Martin Luther in 1517. Those Protestants are going to go to British North America, to the colonies. Um, Puritans are a lot of these people. People that we call the Pilgrims are these people. And they're not so worried about converting natives. The natives are really kind of viewed as a threat of a threat to what they're trying to live their lives, because remember, these are the people that colonized. They moved there, and they took native land. And because of that, we're going to deal with a whole lot of the natives are going to be really far away. Now, in Latin America, these are Catholics, and missionary work is a very important thing for them. Remember that the Catholics during this time had been attacked from the inside by Martin Luther, and attacked from the outside by the Ottoman Empire, and then also uh, the Muslims from northern Africa. And so they kind of look at it as coming from both sides. And because of that, spreading their religion is going to be really important, because they're afraid that Christianity is going to be taken over by Islam. And so these Dominicans, Franciscans, and Jesuits, these are all orders of missionaries, and priests who go out to um, try to spread Catholicism around the world. And then finally, the Russian Orthodox, or the Eastern Orthodox Church. Remember that Russia is spreading into Siberia and becoming what Russia is today, which is the biggest country on the planet. And as they spread, they're going to spread their religion of Christianity, of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Okay. Oh no, I spelled benefited wrong. Well, help me here. Okay. So the expansion, how is it related to Christianity? The spread of Christianity. Christianity is going to motivate the spread, and it's also going to benefit from it. How's it going to motivate it? Well, we need to convert these poor savages. We need to civilize them. We need to get them to Jesus, right? And the Portuguese are going to do that early on in Africa and in Asia. And we see Spanish and French doing that for the Catholics in the Americas, and then the Russian Orthodox out into Siberia. And then also, they're going to benefit from it. And that has a whole lot to do with tithing. So not only are individual church members expected to pay their tithes. And if you don't know what tithing is, it means you're supposed to give part of your money to the church. But also, kingdoms are expected to tithe as well. And as they do that, we're going to see the church get more and more money, particularly the Catholic Church, as Spain and Portugal are going to come out with a whole lot of money. And then finally, the Crusades, right? A crusade is a holy war, and these Catholics have been doing this since um, the like what is it 1066 is the first crusade, and they're definitely going to see their religion as being attacked, and we need to make sure Christianity is taken care of. Yeah. So Spain and Portugal were definitely the best at spreading Christianity, um, and this is because the strong control that Spain is going to have in Latin America, and also the Philippines, which we haven't talked much about the Philippines, but we will. Also in Latin America and the Philippines, literacy was very low. There really weren't a lot of written down religious traditions. And there wasn't like a big bureaucratic religious system. And so when Christianity was spread to these areas, there wasn't a lot of pushback because there wasn't like a large organization to push back. But if we go to China, we have thousands of years of written religion. India is the same way. And in the Middle East, with Islam, we got at least around 1,000 years, which is not too shabby, not too shabby. And yeah, okay. So um, I mentioned this earlier. Am I losing my voice? Oh no. What can I do? How can I teach the children? Los niños. I'll get more like this. All right. So when the Aztecs and the Brock's got the COVID because he can't talk. You know, I've not tasted anything for weeks. I'm kidding. Oh my lord. Uh, Courtney just cooks really bland dinners. That's what it is. All right, just kidding. Love you. I know you watch my lectures every night. Uh, okay, so when the Aztecs and the Incas take over, um, the people who got took over are going to absorb the religion of their conquerors. Okay, and so when the Europeans come in, they conquer, then it's just kind of going to be the way it is. We the Most natives, especially in Latin America, about 1,700 are baptized. And we have the Europeans doing really cool things, like flogging natives. Um, they also like to get the statues of the native gods and pee on them. That's actually in the textbook, and they would make people who um, who refused to get baptized, they would make them do what they call processions of shame, which means they would walk like a little sad parade, and people would throw rocks at them and spit on them. You know, fun times. And so we do see some pushback, and probably the biggest pushback is the Taki Onkoi rebellion, and this was um, uh, the a lot of well, not a lot. Um, it's a dance. It's an Indian god dance, and so this god would possess the natives, and they would start dancing, and they would start uh, uh, summoning the Inca gods to come back and kill the Spanish. And I don't know how many of the Inca gods actually materialized and came and killed the Spanish, but the Spanish were scared to death, and so they went around eradicating anybody who agreed with this rebellion. Um, and there's this really neat section of the book where there were some good spirited Spanish people who worked together with some Inca to build this beautiful church. And it took them years and years and years. And finally, it's done. And so the Spanish tell the Inca, come Sunday morning, we're going to have our first service. It's going to be a beautiful celebration. Uh, and when the Spanish show up to the first service, they see the Inca, and the Inca all have these pails of llama blood. And the Spanish are like, "What the heck are you guys doing? Why do you have this llama blood?" And they're like, "This is a sacred place of religion, right?" And the Spanish are like, "Yeah." And they're like, "Okay, shouldn't we cover it in llama blood? I mean, that's how we think that that's our religion. Let's pour llama blood all over the church." The Spanish, not being so open-minded to allow llama blood to drip from the ceilings of their church, said, "Oh, you crazy Inca." So yeah, they didn't kill him, which is, anytime people don't get killed, we can say that's a good thing. Um, so we talked about voodoo and Santeria before, and I'm not sure if I talked about how the saints in Catholicism can be easily adopted by polytheists. And so, because there's all these aspects in polytheism, a god is like a water god and a sun god and a god of farming. And we see with a lot of the Catholic saints a similar setup. So the patron saint of water takes the place of the water god. We're going to see that the Spanish are always going to speak Spanish. The priests are always going to speak Spanish, but they are going to put in place a church leader. And that church leader is going to lead services in the native language. And that church leader is going to help um, kind of move the idea uh, of different gods to um, the reverence of saints. And um, where we end up here's a good quote from Strayer. In such ways did Christianity take root in the new cultural environments of Spanish America, but it was distinctly Andean or Mexican Christianity, not merely a copy of the Spanish version. Um, let's hop over to China. In China, it was not a violent overthrow of the religion that was already there, because China already had a strong bureaucracy. They had a standing army, and it just wasn't going to go down like that. So what we see here is the Jesuits. And why in the heck did I not put the Jesuits on here? Let's make that big. So the Jesuits are like these ambassadors of Christianity. And so they come, hi, I can't see phones in my class. What are you talking about? I can't. All right. So for Hmm. So these Jesuits are sort of like um, ambassadors, and they're going to use the elitism. Let me go back. They're going to use their knowledge of science and technology um, to kind of make themselves make Christianity something that is respected because it's useful. And even in the beginning, they're not gonna show up as saying, "Hey, we want to convert everybody." They're gonna do it really like on the down low. They're low key, right? Also, um, uh, a um, a thing that they don't do is pee on the idols in China. That makes things okay. And they didn't really convert many people at all. The people that they did convert were elites. It's the Chinese really see Christians as being weird. And this is something that a lot of people who don't know a lot about Christianity think is, communion, right? The body of Christ and the blood of Christ. Um, they're definitely today, and definitely back then, a lot of people um, see the bread and the wine as the literal body and blood of Christ. And then, an outsider is going to look at that and say, "You're eating the body of your God? This is ridiculous." And so a lot of them saw communion as cannibalism. And cannibalism doesn't go over very well with very many people. Um, when the Pope starts to take more of a strong-handed approach to the Chinese Christians, the emperor is going to say, "Get out of here, missionaries," and that's going to keep Chinese missionary or Christian missionaries out of China uh, for quite a while. Quite a while. Okay. Um, so, um, why? Um, why is it not they're not as effective in China as they are in Spanish America? A lot of things we talked about earlier. Economic and social powers are going to be taken away in the Americas uh, and not in China. Um, the authorities have a lot more power in China than in the Americas. And there's the Jesuits, not really focusing on converting the masses, but more focused on converting the elites. They think if the elites convert, then the elites will have um, a big influence on the masses. Um, and we're going to talk about in the last unit, we talked about the daimyo and the Japanese feudal system, and how that was kind of the norm in Japan. And the daimyo are going to be Japanese nobility. They're going to have control over the samurai that we talked about. So the daimyo are going to be all over. There's going to be all these different daimyo all over Japan. Is that thunder in January? I'm scared. I'm very scared. Or is it a bombing? Missiles? If anybody sees radiation, green gas, let me know. I want to turn into the Hulk. That'd be so cool. All right. So if this is my last video, please, Courtney, I love you. Smitten, I hate you. Smitten's my cat. Okay. Um, so, um, so we're gonna have So decentralized power. We talked about that last time. How the emperor is not really the emperor, and all the daimyo and shogun are kind of running their own thing. But here comes this guy Tokugawa Ieyasu, and I think we've talked about him this unit. He's going to restrict the power of the daimyo. He's going to bring in all the daimyo that they have to live in Edo, which is the capital, every other year. And so they're not going to have as much power over their individual land than they do over there, because they're back and forth. They call this the hostage system, like like um, the shogun is taking the daimyo hostage every other year, and basically the Tokugawa shogun, right, Tokugawa Ieyasu, he's going to unite all of Japan. And that is something that you really need to know. And this is really the first time in history that not all of Japan, but most of Japan is under one ruler. And we're going to see him do a lot of stuff like they're doing in China and they're doing in a lot of other parts of the world, like public works projects like bridges and other things, schools and 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 done by the daimyo who used to be like warlords all over Japan, and now it's almost like they're governors who are working for the president, who is the shogun. Okay, it is time to go to lunch. Let's pause this thing. Okay, friends, let's finish this up. So yeah, daimyo. Here's another group in China. These are the Manchu, and I think we mentioned the Manchu earlier. They are from northeastern China, and they're going to be different ethnic groups than the Ming. And you may hear Jurchen, and definitely you know about the Mongols. And then there's also Han Chinese. Remember, there's so many different ethnic groups in China. So you probably remember that the Ming Dynasty finished the wall, the Great Wall, and it worked great because the Qing just come right over it. The Manchus, the people are Manchurians. That the part of China they're from is called Manchuria, and the dynasty is called the Qing Dynasty. And I know Q makes a CH sound, but there you go. They took over the government. And one thing to think about for the Qing is they are an ethnic minority and they're in control of all of China. We see that with oh, why can't I think about the dynasty in northern India? Holy cow. Wow. The Mughal Empire, there you go. The Mughal Empire, who were Muslims, in control of most of India. It's a similar setup. And the Qing are going to stay ethnically Manchu, but they are going to adopt some things that led to governing, and things like Confucianism, the Chinese language, and this idea of the mandate of heaven. They claim that they had the mandate of heaven for their dynasty, even though they were outsiders. And last but not least, how is gender and family? How do they have to? What changes happen here? The first thing is in Southeast Asia, a lot of women were in charge of trade. And so there's a power dynamic shift here. when we see European men, these, strong gun having, tough guys, who are really beholden, um, to women from Southeast Asia. We see this on the Malay Peninsula, which is most of Malaysia now, in the Philippines and Indonesia as well. And this is all in Southeast Asia. Matriarchal societies, we talked about, in Southeast Asia, how, wealth is, the wealth of a man is passed to a woman in marriage, and um, that becomes a shared wealth, which is not very common in societies during this time. Um, we're going to have, women being just as educated as men, and they're working in finance and trade, which is very different. Um, and for the trade being ran by women, it's these large outdoor markets, um, and we're going to see a lot of long distance trade controlled by women. And we're even going to see, these mini trade empires, where these women in charge are going to, um, accrue quite quite a lot of wealth. And with all that said, that is the end of this lesson for today. A little bit longer, but we covered a lot of stuff. And see you soon.